that's where the problem lies, If you look at the original definition of leadership, now leadership as was defined by Barnard Bass, he's from University of Birmingham. I don't know the year in which he wrote this, but should be somewhere around 1950s, 1960s. He says that leadership can be considered the exercise of influence or a power relation or an instrument of goal achievement or a differentiated role. Just notice, this definition is kind of value-free. He's not saying that, being a leader means being a good leader. He's not saying that, he's not talking about something bad about the leadership. There are other, ways of looking at leadership, and in fact, Professor Kellerman also cites the same in her book also, that leadership is more of a process. And there are players in this process. One of the players is the leader himself. The other important player in this whole equation is the follower. And she very categorically says that leadership cannot happen in a vacuum. You need at least one follower. And she also mentions about the fact that the context in which this dynamic is played out is also very important. So all these three are very important to understanding leadership. And finally, of course, the output. Generally, more often than not, we look at leaders more from the output point of view. I mean, we say a leader is good or leader is bad because the results that were kind of produced. Now, there can be a lot of, if we try to go in, as we discuss along the way, we might find, that all things said about leaders might not be true. Now, just to kind of give you a structure of how the leadership work has progressed, this is of course, my mentor in Asian Institute of Management, Professor Gavino, whom I respect a lot, and Professor Portugal from New York State University. There's an article which they've kind of published very recently in the World Management Journal, and I got a copy of that from Professor Gavino, and that's where he kind of puts it out. Why I'm putting this slide is because it will give you a sense of how research and academic work on leadership has progressed over time. So there has been a lot of literature which has kind of been written on leadership. They have been written in the fields of psychology, sociology, political science and management. The focuses of course have been kind of different. For example, if you look at psychology, probably one of the striking elements of such kind of research is you will find they're discussing more about the traits of a leader. What kind of traits a leader has? Why does somebody become a leader? There's also a very interesting, I don't know whether you've heard of him, he's Professor Ron Heifetz of Harvard. He's from the School of Government, Kennedy's School of Government, and he has written something on adaptive leadership. So it's more of a psychological kind of approach. Sociology deals with more about behavior in groups, whereas political science has been more focused on containment of leaders and followers both. See, when we look at the kind of political canvas, we see that framers of constitution and fathers of countries have been interested in kind of creating checks and balances for leaders who kind of lead the country. That's because their fundamental presumption was that human beings left on their own are probably not expected to behave well. They are probably not expected to behave well. So they will do some things which are wrong. So they want to kind of create checks and balances. As I said, the views on leadership, it's some views around the process itself. Some views are on how followers comply with leaders. Some people talk about how leaders influence a group of followers. Then you have power relations being discussed, and of course there is a big deal of talk about management and the distinction between management and leadership. Going forward, please don't get confused when somebody discusses leadership, because when somebody is talking about theories, for example styles of leadership, the focus is generally on the leader. And when people are talking about great man theory and all these kind of theories, they're again focusing on the leader. There are some aspects like participative leadership where people actually talk about the dynamic between the follower and the leader, and there are theories which kind of talk about the context. So if you keep this diagram in mind, it'll kind of it'll get clear in your mind what is somebody trying to refer to, instead of kind of getting confused about why this is required and all that. Moving on, this is not about the book, but this is something I wanted to just tell you. The current research is all about understanding one's leadership style. So how does one understand his own leadership style? how does he adapt to a particular context, change his leadership style, and that's the challenge what researchers are kind of working now. So when we talk about this book, in this frame of reference is kind of a bit old, but this nonetheless, it's a very important, piece to kind of go through. Now, I'll now come to the book. So if you look at this process of leadership, where in the leaders and the followers, there's a dynamic and there's an output, what does Professor Kellerman do? Professor Kellerman basically cuts through this process. See, she actually starts with the output part of it, and she kind of divides this process in two parts, good and bad. So she comes up with certain questions, why bad leadership happens. She focuses a bit on the bad leaders, and she also focuses somewhat on followers. Why I say somewhat is because there's a complete book which is dedicated to followers. So the discussion about followers is much more in depth in the other book. There's also some focus on the consequence of this dynamic, that is basically the output, and she also kind of throws in some tips how you can kind of maintain your balance and start moving from bad to good. So that's the book in a nutshell, what Professor Kellerman tries to talk about. She starts with some broad questions. What she fundamentally says is that whenever we discuss leadership, in fact I would say whenever we discuss leaders, the tendency is to kind of gravitate towards discussing good leaders. So we end up discussing the Nelson Mandelas and the Mahatma Gandhis, but we don't discuss, for example, Saddam Hussein. Now, what happens is, in the political scenario, Saddam Hussein was also a leader. He had followers. He led a country. So we don't discuss, these kind of leaders. Now, it's kind of pretty confusing. For example, when you talk about Jack Welch in the corporate world, you don't discuss about Rajat Gupta. Now, Rajat Gupta was a pretty successful, leader till the point of time he was kind of I would say, he was kind of discovered, to put it very straight. So now, why don't we discuss this? I mean, what is so uncommon between these sets of people? There could be a lot of similarities between these sets of people, and there could be a set of differences. And as students of leadership, or if we want to kind of practice leadership, it's probably good that we understand what is probably common between them and what is probably not very common between them. She also raises some fundamental questions like, why is leadership discussed with a positive slant? What is common between celebrated heroes and fallen heroes? Why do leaders behave badly? What about followers? Do we discuss followers in our discussions? And any mental model for measuring leaders and followers? She just touches upon this. I'm not going to discuss this because I think it's a little bit out of the scope, but I have created a mental model for myself, and I've showed that mental model in some of the forums. But she has just touched upon this. She basically tries to create an idea where you kind of, when you look at a leader, when you work with a leader, you have something in your mind, a kind of framework by which you can evaluate, should I be led by you? You should be able to answer this question. So I think that's more or less the attempt she wants to make there. Now, if you look at the first question, we said that why is this leadership discussed with a positive slant? Now, what she mentions in her book is that leadership studies have not always been about optimism. There has been a dose of optimism in different points of time. She first mentions about Machiavelli. So what Machiavelli says, Machiavelli was a kind of pragmatist. So what he kind of professed was that he wanted to use cruelty as an arrow in his quiver. So what he basically meant was that for getting a particular work done, if you need to be cruel or a little bit, I would say, unkind sometimes, it's okay. Okay. Now, when it came to John Gardner, I'll kind of read out what John Gardner, Burns, and Lawrence Summers said. These are very interesting kind of, I would say, turning points in the study of leadership, because I feel they gave kind of a positive twist to the word leadership. They focused more on the leader. Now, if you look at the other side, the studies that have been done in political science, for example, or probably in philosophy, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of research which has been done on containment of followers as well as leaders. Now, the question here is, why so much optimism, which has been kind of mentioned by people like John Gardner, and the likes? It's because they were kind of in the US somewhere around the 1970s. I don't know the exact years. Now, during that point